Okay, let's just jump right in. We got a request for a deep dive that I found really fascinating. It's not about a huge historical event or some famous figure.
No, not at all. It's actually focused on a single, very short, and let's say intensely controversial mention in a sacred text.
Exactly. And this one little mention has spawned centuries of, well, conflicting stories, huge theological fights, and some of the most dramatic folklore you can imagine.
It's a perfect example of how a tiny, really dense piece of source material can be spun in so many different directions over time. I mean, you start pulling at this thread and you find these competing origin stories for one of the most mysterious topics in religious history.
Right. We're going deep on the story of Harut and Marut. These are two figures who show up in the Quran, and they're linked directly to the origin of forbidden magic, specifically in ancient Babylon, which is, modern-day Iraq.
And this is high-stakes stuff, textually speaking, because the question underneath it all is pretty fundamental. Where did this forbidden, destructive knowledge actually come from?
So our mission for this deep dive is to basically walk through the three major ways people have tried to understand these figures.
Right. First, we have to cover the most popular version, the folklore. This is the story everyone's heard, the dramatic one. Then we'll pivot to the orthodox theological argument, which sees them as part of a divine test.
And finally, we get to the most radical view,
Hmm.
a deep structural linguistic argument that says we've been misunderstanding who or what they are for over 1,000 years.
But before any of that, we have to ground ourselves in the actual text. It's just one verse, Surah al-Baqarah, Ayah 102.
And it's dense. It packs in King Solomon, the Shiite and the devils, and the teaching of magic in Babylon. It starts by saying people followed what the devils recited over the kingdom of Solomon.
And the verse is really careful. It immediately clears Solomon, says he wasn't involved in disbelief. The blame is put squarely on the devils for teaching magic. And then we get the line that started it all.
And they followed what was sent down upon the two angels, in Babylon, Harut, and Marut.
And right away, there's this non-negotiable warning. It's built into the verse, and it's central to every single interpretation we're going to talk about.
It says, "And Harut and Marut taught no one until they had said, 'We are but a trial, so do not disbelieve.'"
And what did people do? The verse tells us immediately, yet the people learned from them that by which they could cause separation between a man and his spouse.
That detail is so specific, it's not about making gold or flying. It's about separating a man and his wife. It anchors this knowledge in something deeply destructive to the family, to society itself.
Right. But before we get into the why they were sent, we really have to spend some time on that dominant story, the one that became a legend.
Okay, so let's start there, the folklore.
When you ask most people about Harut and Marut, this is the story they'll tell you. The one that's Dayafil Nas, the one that's just widely circulated.
And this version, they are what? Actual angels?
Yes, two pure celestial angels, Malakon. And they're sent down by God to Babylon as a fitna, a trial, a test. Not just for humans, but as it turns out for themselves, too.
So they weren't evil to begin with. They were divine messengers, but they were carrying this potent, dangerous knowledge.
Exactly. And the big difference between them and the Shayateen, the devils who are already down there making trouble, is that Harut and Marut were authorized. They weren't rogue, but they could only teach after giving that explicit warning.
We are but a trial, so do not disbelieve. That phrase is the whole point of the test, isn't it?
It's the entire crux. The act of learning the magic, knowing that warning, was a conscious choice, a willful rejection. You were choosing to commit kufr, disbelief, by taking the magic.
And people did. They chose the destructive path. The source makes it clear they immediately used it to cause harm, specifically separating couples. The magic wasn't for anything productive, it was for malice and discord.
But that still doesn't explain what happened to the angels themselves in this story. That's where, the real drama comes in.
Right, the anecdotal stuff.
That's right. The really explosive details come from early sources, like the comprehensive Tafsir al-Abari and some weaker narrations in Musnad Ahmad. These stories don't just paint the angels as teachers, they paint them as tragic figures who fail spectacularly.
And it all starts from a place of, what, angelic arrogance? A sense of moral superiority?
Precisely. The story begins up in the heavens. The angels are watching humanity, all the sin, the corruption, the bloodshed, and they start to question God's patience.
They're basically saying, how can you put up with this? We're up here praising you perfectly, and they're down there making a total mess of things.
And God's response is this profound challenge, something along the lines of, I gave humans desires, appetites, shahat that you don't have. If you had them, you might not do any better.
So it becomes a direct challenge. Okay, Pick 2 of your best, send them down, let's see how they handle it.
And they choose Harut and Marut. But here's the twist. The moment they descend, they're given the human capacity for intense desire. The sources use this specific word, al-shabak, which is like an overwhelming carnal lust, something totally alien to their nature.
So the stage is set. They're in Babylon, they have human weaknesses, and of course they are immediately tested by a beautiful woman.
And in many versions of the story, she's identified with Al-Zura, the planet Venus. So it connects her to beauty, lust, destiny, all at once.
She sees their desire and gives them an ultimatum.
3 escalating demands, and these are not small things. They're capital sins. The first is shirk polytheism, associating partners with God. The second, murder a child. The third, drink alcohol.
And at first, they're horrified. They say, absolutely not. We'll never commit shirk. They refuse to murder the child, but they look at the third option.
Right. And this is the psychological turning point. They see drinking wine as the least bad option, a temporary mistake, not like eternal polytheism or murder.
It's a fatal miscalculation.
It's the tragic flaw that makes the story so powerful. They think it's a small sin, but they don't realize it's the gateway to all the others. They drink the wine, they get completely intoxicated, and in that state,
They do everything they refuse to do. They commit fornication with her and they murder the child.
it's just devastating. And when they sober up, the horror of what they've done sets in. The woman reveals the test, and in some versions, she ascends to the heavens and becomes the star Venus, cutting off their return.
They're trapped, fallen,
Yeah.
and they get a choice for their punishment.
Yes. Punishment now in this world or the greater punishment in the afterlife, they choose the former, suggesting they still fear eternal damnation.
And the punishment described in these stories is just brutal.
It's harrowing. They're hung upside down, some say in a well in Babylon, others say suspended between heaven and earth, just tormented until the day of judgment.
Wow. I mean, as a myth, it's incredibly powerful. It gives you a very clear, if tragic, origin for black magic. It's a failed divine test.
But that narrative is the very thing that sparked this huge scholarly debate.
Which brings us to the big question. If this story is so well known, what's the problem with it? Why do so many respected scholars just reject it outright?
Okay, so now we have to get into that backlash. Because while the story of fallen angels is, gripping, it creates this massive theological problem that a lot of scholars just could not get past.
The core contradiction being what?
The nature of angels themselves. The text described them elsewhere as honorable servants who do not disobey him. They're seen as these perfectly obedient beings. So how can they suddenly fall prey to lust and murder? It doesn't compute with their core definition.
If angels are, by definition, incapable of sinning, then a story about them sinning has to be wrong.
That was the argument. And it was a serious one. We're talking about huge figures like Ibn Ashur, al-Fakhr al-Razi, Ibn Kathir. They basically dismissed these stories as Khurafiyya-fabricated myths, superstitions.
They felt it undermined the entire concept of the celestial host.
Exactly. And they didn't just dismiss it. They tried to figure out where it came from. They traced a lot of these dramatic details, the woman, the drinking, the punishment, back to what they suspected were non-prophetic sources.
Like Jewish lore, or what's known as Israeliyat.
Precisely. They pointed fingers at early figures like Ka'b al-Ahbar, who was known for introducing many of these narratives. The argument was that these stories weren't just weakly transmitted, they were actively invented, Maktalak, and so they couldn't be trusted.
Okay, so if we throw out the dramatic fall from grace story, we're back to the original problem from the verse. God sent 2 figures, Harut and Marut, to teach magic in Babylon.
And that brings us to the great commentator Abu Jafar al-Tabari. He tackles this head-on. If the angels are pure, why would God send them to teach something so harmful?
What was his answer?
Tabari's rationale is brilliant, really. He shifts the focus away from the teachers and onto the nature of knowledge itself. He argues that the knowledge they taught was neutral.
Neutral. How can knowledge of black magic be neutral?
Well, think of it this way. God allows us to know the mechanics of both good and evil. We have knowledge of how theft works, or how to make wine, or build idols.
Right. A chemist knows how to make a poison, but the sin is in actually using it to harm someone. The knowledge isn't the sin, the action is.
That's it exactly. Tabari's point is, there is no sin in the mere knowledge of magic. The guilt lies entirely in the practice of it, the alam al-bihi, especially when you use it to do forbidden harm.
So the angels were sinless. Their job was just to be instructors. They deliver the information, they give the warning, and then the human has to make a choice. The trial is entirely on the human recipient.
It perfectly preserves the integrity of the angels. But that leads to the next question. Why was this knowledge necessary right then, in that place? Why Babylon?
And the argument is that the context was critical.
Yes. Tabari and others argue that at that time in Babylon, sorcerers, the Sahar, had become so skilled and powerful that they were starting to claim they were prophets. They were blurring the line between magic tricks and actual divine miracles.
So the trial wasn't about tempting people to do evil. It was about empowering them to spot fakes.
It was a defensive educational mission. God sent the angels to teach people how magic actually works, so they could tell the difference between a cheap trick from a charlatan and a real miracle from a true prophet like Moses.
It's like a divine fact-checking program. If you know how the trick is done, you can't be fooled by it.
Exactly. This is the divine necessity argument. It completely cleans up the story, makes the angels necessary teachers of negative knowledge for a positive outcome.
Okay, but there's one other sort of grammatical escape hatch here, right?
Yes, a minority view, but an interesting one. It focuses on the little word ma in the phrase and what was sent down upon the two angels.
And the idea is that ma doesn't have to mean what.
It could be interpreted as nafia, which means not, a negation.
So if you read it that way, the verse becomes, and the magic was not sent down upon the two angels.
Right. It basically takes them out of the equation entirely. In that reading, the magic comes only from the shayateen mentioned earlier. Harut and Marut are just there, maybe as witnesses.
It's a neat fix, but it does feel like it hinges on a very specific reading of one tiny word.
It does, and it's generally been seen as a minority view. But all of this, the folklore, the theological defense, the negation, is what the final radical critique says is missing the point entirely.
Because they argue everyone is focused on the wrong part of the verse. They're all debating the story instead of analyzing the words.
And that's where we're headed next, the argument that the very identity of Harut and Marut has been fundamentally misunderstood from the beginning.
All right, so let's dive into this radical linguistic critique.
Yeah.
This is where things get really deep into the weeds of the language itself.
They do, and the proponents of this view, they argue that if you apply a kind of scientific reading to the text, focusing on word morphology, the entire idea of celestial angels teaching magic just dissolves.
Okay, so walk us through it slowly. The whole argument hangs on one word, right? Al-Malakain, the two angels. What's wrong with that translation?
The problem, according to this view, is twofold. The definite article al, the hal, and the root of the word itself. The argument is that al-malak with the al isn't the singular of malika, angels. It's a collective noun, an ismjins.
Okay, for those of us who aren't experts in classical Arabic grammar, what's a simple way to understand a collective noun in this context?
Think of a term like the guard at a palace. The guard doesn't mean one single person. It refers to the entire functional group of guardsmen. An individual member of that group would be called a harasi.
I see. So the guard refers to the institution, the unit.
Exactly. So al-Malakain doesn't have to mean two individual celestial beings. It could refer to two types or two categories of high-ranking attendants or special agents who are serving some kind of authority.
And given that the context is magic and devils, the authority figure they're serving would be?
Iblis. Satan. They are his special attendants, his agents.
Whoa! That is a huge shift. But hold on, why would all those early, brilliant scholars like Tabari and Ibn Kathir miss a common grammatical structure like that?
That's the core of the challenge. The argument is that the theological need to explain the story overrode the linguistic evidence. Once the folklore of the fallen angels took hold, the scholars felt they had to interpret Malakine as angels and then build these elaborate defenses to explain their actions.
So they were trying to solve a theological problem that, according to this view, they themselves created by misreading the term in the first place.
That's the claim, that centuries of debate are built on a grammatical misunderstanding.
So if they aren't angels, and they are two categories of evil attendants, what does this linguistic analysis say Harut and Marut actually are?
This is where they look at the names themselves. They argue the names Harut and Marut aren't just names. They're descriptions derived from Arabic roots that mean things like malice and rebellion.
Okay, let's break that down. Start with Harut.
Harut is said to come from the root erd, which means to slander, to plot, to attack someone's honor. It's about sowing discord through words. So this view defines Harut as representing the Cheyenne of mankind, the human devils.
The people who use gossip, lies, and character assassination to break people up.
And that connects perfectly back to the specific crime mentioned in the verse, separating a husband and wife. What's the most common way to do that? Slander. Malicious rumors. It's a purely human but devilish tactic.
Okay, so Harut represents the human agent of destruction. What about Marut?
Marut comes from the root marut, which means rebellious, arrogant, disobedient. This, they argue, represents the Shayan of Jinn, the unseen spiritual forces of rebellion. The name itself, in that form, Farud, suggests an intensified quality, like we see in names like Talut or Jalut. So Marut is the intensely rebellious one.
So Harut and Marut aren't two guys named Harut and Marut. They are collective terms for the two main sources of evil. The devils among humans who use slander, and the devils among the jinn who use spiritual rebellion.
Exactly. And once you see it that way, you suddenly find perfect parallels elsewhere in the Quran that divide evil into these exact two categories.
Right, let's bring those in. First, there's Surah Al-Amma, verse 1 and 12.
Which says, "We made for every prophet an enemy, devils of men and jinn, inspiring one another with decorated speech."
It's the same two groups. The linguistic critique says Harut and Marut are just another name for these two groups, the agents of Iblis sent to teach discord in Babylon.
And then you have the final chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Nas, which warns against the whispers that come from among the jinn and mankind.
It's the same dichotomy. Jinnah and Nas, jinn and mankind, Marut and Harut. It's a consistent pattern.
And if that's true, then the entire context shifts. There's no fall from grace, so there's no need for Tabari's theological defense. The folklore just becomes a myth that got attached to what were originally just linguistic identifiers for the sources of evil.
To really sell this argument, though, we have to be sure this whole definite article thing is consistent. This al turning a word into a special category.
Right. And to appreciate that, we need to spend a bit more time on just how powerful that little particle al can be in the Quranic text. It's really the linchpin.
It's more than just the word the. It can take a common noun and make it this highly specific technical term.
It's like a definitive tag. And the source provides a killer example to show this pattern. The difference between mu'min and al-mu'min.
Okay, so mu'min without the al means what?
It just means a believer. It's used all over the place to refer to any believing human, male or female. It's a general description.
But al-mu'min with the al.
It appears only once in the entire Quran, and it refers exclusively to God as one of his divine names. Al-Mu'min, the giver of faith, the faithful one.
So the al completely changes its function from a general human quality to a unique divine attribute.
Precisely. So the radical critique argues that when we see al-Malakain, we should expect it to have a similarly specialized restrictive meaning. The traditional reading, by just treating it as two generic angels, is ignoring this clear linguistic pattern.
They're missing the tag. They're failing to see that the definite article is signaling that this isn't a normal use of the word.
That's the argument. The theological puzzle of fallen angels was created by a failure to see the word for what it was, a collective noun for two specific types of agents.
Let's use the other example from the source to really hammer this home. The word al-Saq.
This is a perfect parallel because, again, it's a case where a simple literal translation creates a huge theological problem. In this case, anthropomorphism, the idea of giving God a physical body.
Right. Saq is usually translated as leg or shin, and there's a famous hadith related to this.
Yes, a hadith mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, but which some scholars like Al-Hakim al-Shi'i dismissed as fabricated. It describes God revealing his shin on the Day of Judgment.
Which is a theological minefield. It seems to give God a physical body part, which contradicts the core concept of God's absolute transcendence.
But the linguistic correction, applying the same rule we used for al-Malakain, completely solves the problem. The source argues that al-Saq, with the definite article, is a collective noun. It refers to the group being driven to the place of assembly. It's about action and intensity.
So the phrase from the Quran, and the Saq is joined to the Saq, isn't about legs.
Not at all. It means the crowds are being driven one after another in a continuous, intense flow without rest. The collective noun refers to the mass of people being pushed together.
And this is backed up by old Arabic sayings.
Yes. The idiom, the work is at Qadam Wasak, means the work is being done at full strength. Al-Qadam is the arriving group, and Al-Saq is the group being driven to the task. It implies a relentless, full-capacity effort.
That's incredible. It shows how seeing the definite article as a marker for a collective noun can resolve a major theological issue without any special pleading. It just got grammar.
And if you apply that same consistent logic to Harut and Marut, the radical rereading doesn't seem so radical anymore. It seems linguistically consistent. They aren't fallen angels. They're the two categories of devils that already exist, and the text is just identifying them as the source of this specific magic.
Which brings us to our final question.
Yeah.
What exactly was this magic?
Right. Now that we have these three competing origin stories, we have to look at the magic itself.
And the sources seem to differentiate between two very different types of Sur.
A critical distinction, yes. And it holds true no matter which of the three interpretations you lean towards.
Okay, let's define type 1, illusion.
This is Sior al-Ayun, literally charming the eyes. This is the kind of magic you see described in the story of Moses and the Egyptian sorcerers. The Quran says they charmed the eyes of the people and induced fear.
So it's a massive spectacle. It's about tricking people's perception, making them see things that aren't there. It's about awe and fear through mass hallucination.
Think of it as ancient, high-level stagecraft. They throw down ropes, and through their skill, the audience is convinced they're seeing snakes. The ropes don't actually become snakes.
But the magic tied to Harut and Marut in Babylon is completely different. It's way more sinister.
Totally different. This is the magic of the jinn and the shayin, black magic. It's not about public spectacle. It's about private, targeted harm.
It's invasive. It's not just fooling your eyes. It's trying to mess with your mind, your emotions, your body.
Yes. The verse is surgically precise. It was used to cause sickness, distress, and manipulation with the ultimate goal of
Separating a man from his spouse.
the contrast is huge. In Egypt, magic was a tool of the state to impress a king. In Babylon, it was a weapon of psychological warfare to destroy the family.
And if we go back to that linguistic theory for a second, that Harut is slander and Marut is spiritual rebellion, it makes perfect sense why this magic would be so effective at destroying a marriage.
It lines up perfectly. Slander from the human devils destroys trust from the outside, and spiritual rebellion from the jinn devils creates suspicion and emotional distance from the inside. It's a two-pronged attack.
So no matter how you slice it, whether they were fallen angels, divine teachers, or personified evils, the end result is the same. The knowledge they taught was aimed at destroying unity. The most powerful magic was the kind that could tear two people apart.
That specific detail about the marriage bond really underscores how this form of Sur wasn't about flashy tricks. It was about the deep psychological manipulation of human relationships.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this all up. We've covered a lot of ground, all from just a few words in one verse.
We really have. We started with Harut and Marut as these tragic figures from folklore, the fallen angels whose story is compelling but theologically very messy.
Then we moved to the Orthodox defense. The pivot made by scholars like Al-Tabari, who tried to clean things up by framing the whole event as a necessary divine test, meant to teach humanity how to spot charlatans.
And finally, we ended with the most radical theory of all, the linguistic critique that says we've been misreading the key words for centuries. That Harut and Marut aren't individuals at all, but personifications of human malice and jinn rebellion.
It really shows you how a single phrase in a foundational text can hold all these layers of meaning. The entire story changes depending on whether you read it through a historical lens, a theological lens, or a purely linguistic one.
And the difference between a whole mythology of fallen angels and a simple grammatical definition comes down to the meaning of one tiny definite article, al.
It's a powerful reminder to, always question the default story, especially with texts that have this much history and baggage attached to them.
The deepest meaning can sometimes be hiding in the technical details, just waiting for someone to look at the words themselves, fresh, without all the assumptions.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought to chew on. The verse is crystal clear that the primary use of this magic was to separate a husband and wife.
Right, to destroy that fundamental bond.
So, if that radical theory is correct, if Harut and Marut really are just the personification of slander from mankind and rebellion from the jinn, does that suggest that the most powerful, destructive form of Sur isn't some spell or incantation?
What if it's just the active, targeted use of deceit and discord to break the essential bonds of human society? Maybe the greatest and most forbidding magic of all is just the malicious weaponization of language and trust.